Today's daf is daf tzadi tes amid, and we're on daf tzadi ches amid base right at the bottom. The Mishnah had said a few scenarios where somebody's going to do a movement in while they're in one rishus in one domain. They're going to do an action in another domain, and there's a question of whether we're concerned that they're going to bring the item to them or not. So the first halacha was if somebody can stand in a rishus hayachid and move something within a rishus harabim, or vice versa. Somebody can may not, however, urinate from one domain to another domain, and similarly cannot spit from one domain to another domain. And Rabbi Yehuda had said that if they already have the spit, or as the Gemara will tell us, phlegm in their mouth, then they're not. Then they can't continue walking because they'll be carrying. So the Gemara is going to address the first halacha, which is that they're allowed to stand in a one domain in a rishus hayachid, let's say, and move something within the rishus harabim, and as long as they don't move it for amos in the rishus harabim. So the Gemara says, "Masni leRabchina bar Shalmia, l'chiyav barav, kamei the Rav in front of Rav." He taught him, he may not move something in a public domain while he's standing in a private domain. He can't be standing in the rishus hayachid and lean in and carry and move something within the rishus harabim, even less than 4 amos. So he said to him, "Amar lei shavkis rabbanan v'avdis Rabbi Meir." You're leaving the rabbanan, which is our Mishnah, and you're doing like Rabbi Meir, which is, and we'll see in a couple of days, that Rabbi Meir says that you're not allowed to. Rabbi Meir says that you're not allowed to move and lean in your hand in and reach in and take a key that's in the other domain and in the public domain and move it to unlock the door or unlock the gate. And the reason is because maybe you're going to bring it in. So even if you're moving it less than 4 amos, but you may bring it into you, and you're in the private domain, you're in the rishus hayachid. And if you reach out and get the key that's hanging, let's say, on the outside wall and use it to unlock the door, you may bring the key back in with you. And so Rabbi Meir says you're not allowed to, which is what you're teaching. Rabchina bar Shalmi says to him, that's what you taught. Well, why are you teaching Rabbi Meir's opinion and not our Mishnah?
What was the case we saw in Shabbos with the? I don't remember what the case was, but it was something like he had to hold on to something the whole day. He couldn't let go. He had to hold on to something the whole day.
That's if somebody sticks their hand out from a private domain into a public domain on Shabbos. So when he brings it back, he's essentially bringing it back into a private domain.
But if you let go and it's in the but it's not dalet amos. So why would that be different in here?
He transferred from one possession to another, from one rishus to another rishus, from a private to public, or vice versa. There, you don't need 4 amos. You only need 4 amos if you're moving within a public domain.
Uh-huh.
But crossing over a boundary from private to public, that in and of itself is going to be doraisa.
And the case of the key, why is that different?
Because he's moving it in a public domain, but Rabbi Meir is concerned he may bring it in.
Okay.
He's not planning to bring it in. He's reaching outside to get the key to unlock the door while reaching out, or vice versa. Right? He's standing outside and the door is locked, and so he puts his hand in through a window to reach the key and then try and unlock the door from the inside. Either way, right? But the idea is that he's intending to leave it in the domain that it's in. He's leaving it where it is. The problem is that he may end up bringing it towards himself. That's what Rabbi Meir's concern is. So the Gemara says, "Who savar mid the sefer Rabbi Meir? Rishon Amir Rabbi Meir." He thought since the next halacha of Rabbi Meir, of not opening the door is and not using the key because you may bring it to yourself as Rabbi Meir. So too here it's Rabbi Meir and Velohi sefer Rabbi Meir Rishon Rabbanan. That this halacha is the Rabbanan and the halacha is like that, and the halacha later is Rabbi Meir and that's why the halacha actually is that you may move something in a public domain as long as you're not moving it 4 amos and there's no concern you're going to bring it to yourself. As long as he doesn't carry it beyond the 4 amos. It would seem to be saying that if somebody is standing in a private domain and he leans out, reaches out to a public domain and moves something 4 amos, he will transgress carrying and will be a Torah prohibition. And the reason the Gemara thinks this is because since we have to tell you that you're allowed to do this, and really there should be a rabbinic, the Gemara is assuming there should be a rabbinic prohibition because maybe you're going to bring it back to you, or maybe you're going to carry it beyond that. And since it says you can't do that, it would seem that that would be a Torah prohibition. Lema Messiah Leila Rava. So let's say this is proof to Rava's teaching that we saw the other day, that if somebody walks 4 amos, carries something in the public domain 4 amos above 10 tefachim, which is the airspace of the public domain. Above 10 tefachim is no longer airspace in public domain. Above 10 tefachim is now makom potter. So even though that he picked it up from the ground, so he uprooted it from its place in the public domain, and he puts it down in the public domain more than 4 amos away. However, the airspace that this item traveled in was carried in is above the 10 tefachim of the airspace of the public domain. It's in the exempt area. Nevertheless, Rava says Yechayev because it never rested, it never came to a stop in that space. The Amar Rava said that if you carry something from you uprooted it from its place, carried it beyond 4 amos and put it down, even though that it was above the airspace of the public domain within the exempt area when it was carried, is still going to be chayiv because you did the entire thing. You did the akira, you did the anacha, and it never rested. It never came to a stop in the airspace. So Gemara says no proof from here because I can tell you miktani im haitzi chayiv chatas dilma im haitzi pater avalasim. Who tells you? It doesn't say that. The Mishnah only says don't move it the 4 amos, meaning that it's permissible for you while you're standing in the private domain to move an item in the public domain less than 4 amos, but more than 4 amos. It doesn't say that you're going to transgress to the degree that you have to bring a sin offering. It's a Torah prohibition. Could be you don't have to bring a sin offering, but it is prohibited. That would mean it's a rabbinic, the Rabbanan prohibition. And so there's no proof from our Mishnah. And the reason it would be the Rabbanan is because you lifted it. If you're in the private domain, you would have lifted it above the public's the Rishus Harabim airspace. Someone to deduce the other way around. At first, thinking that from the fact that the Mishnah allows you to move this item within the 4 amos is indicative that if you went beyond, you wouldn't transgress a Torah prohibition, because otherwise, perhaps we should prohibit even the less than 4 amos on account of that you may end up doing the 4 amos. So let's say that's a contradiction to Rava that says that even though that the item was carried above the 10 tefachim, but since it started and ended in a public domain, he says it's going to be chayiv, and it never stopped in the airspace above. Again, the Gemara says there's no proof because it doesn't say you're going to exempt. It could be that it would indeed be a prohibition to the degree that you would have a chatas obligation, a sin offering for carrying. The Mishnah's second case was somebody standing in a private domain and either spitting or urinating into a public domain, or vice versa. Amar Rav Yosef Hishtin V'Rak Chayv Chatas. Rav Yosef says not only is it prohibited in the Mishnah, but if they did so, they will have transgressed the Torah prohibition of carrying from a private domain to a public domain, and they have to bring a sin offering. So Gemara says, wait, what are you talking about? We saw at the beginning of Gemara and Shabbos and multiple times throughout the Shabbos and Eruvin that in order to transgress carrying, you have to uproot something from a significant space, and you have to put it down in a significant space. And we say that is a makim dalad al dalad. That's a space that has 4 tefachim. And here, it's coming out of his mouth. It's coming out of the urethra. That's not a makim dalad al dalad. It doesn't have 4 tefachim. So here you don't have that. So Gemara says, machshavto mashvele makim. When somebody, by definition, it needs something to be at a specific space, whether in the space it's coming from or the space it's going to, that by definition defines it as a makim dalad adalin, because machshavta, his intent, and as Rashi says, more than just intent, it's the need that it should be that way, requires makes it into a makim dalad. We saw a similar idea at the beginning of Shabbos, where yada shel adam, that putting something into someone's hand is considered a makim chashav, a significant space, even though that it's less than 4 by 4 tefachim, because that's a makim chashav. Obviously, someone taking possession of something and putting it in their hand would count as a makim chashav. So too here, this counts as a makim chashav because of its necessity and its intent. So where do we see that from? Because if you're not going to say that that's true, Hada Amar Rava, how would you explain this teaching of Rava, or as the Gemara in Shabbos says, Rava? Zorak v'nach b'pia kelev. Somebody throws something and into the mouth of a dog. Or into a smelter, into a fire. Chayev chatas. That would count as a chatas offering. Obligation, meaning a transgressed the Torah prohibition and has to bring a chatas, even though, as the Gemara just asked, but you needed to land, you needed to be put down into a place that has 4 tefachim, and obviously the mouth of the dog will not have 4 tefachim. It's not going to be 12 inches by 12 inches, and it's not going to be, and neither is a fire because it never landed. It burnt up beforehand. Ela machshavte mashvele makim. Or rather, since that's where he needs it to be, he's trying to specifically have the dog catch that, or for it to get burnt up. So therefore, that intent creates the space. So to here, the intent, meaning the need, whether he's got the phlegm in his mouth, he needs to spit, and so that creates that the only place that this can be uprooted from. And same for urinating, and therefore it's going to be the intent counts as a significant space. In other words, the reason it needs to be either removed from or put on a place that is dalad al dalad, in order for it to actually count as being uprooted, it's taken from its place. If it's on a space that's less than that, it could be insignificant and not count as a significant uprooting from its place. But that's only if it doesn't, or the same for placement. It wasn't placed in a significant place. But that's only if that's not where it's needed or necessary to be. But if by necessity it's coming from this place, or by necessity it's going to this place with intent, so that would define it as having been uprooted and carried through to the next domain, or being placed in the next domain. And that's why the mouth of the dog is going to count, and also spitting something from one's mouth, etc., is going to count. So Rav asked, if he himself is standing in the private domain, and he's urinating in the public domain, and the urethra is also in the public domain. So in other words, it even though that the urine is within the ear space of the private domain, but it actually is leaving the body already in the public domain. That we go from where it's being uprooted, meaning its initial space, or where it actually left the body. Teku, he doesn't know the answer. I think Mara is going to let Elio answer that when he comes.
What if it's a really windy day?
Face the other way. V'chein lo yoruk. Similarly, do not spit in on Shabbos from a private domain to public domain, or vice versa. Rabbi Yehuda then said that even just walking with the spit in your mouth counts as carrying. Rabbi Yehuda says that you should not walk until he spits. So Gemara says, is that true? Even if he's not trying to spit it out, meaning he's not, literally means he hasn't turned it over in his mouth, meaning he hasn't turned it into something he's ready to spit. But Tanan, we learned, somebody's eating a teruma fruit, and he has not washed his hands, which we learned in Gemara Shabbos, that there's a gzera of that you have to wash your hands for teruma, otherwise the hands are considered tamei. And he didn't wash his hands, so he's eating teruma without having washed his hands. We are now on 99a in the middle of the daf. So he washed his hand. He didn't wash his hands, and he's eating this fruit. And then he put his hand into his mouth to take out a splinter, a pebble, something that's in his mouth that he needs to get rid of. And by doing so, he touches his saliva, and the saliva will then make his hand make the fruit susceptible to tuma, because it's a liquid that's separated from the body. So Rabbi Meir metame. Rabbi Meir says it now becomes tummy. Rabbi Yossi metayr. Rabbi Yossi says no. As long as the saliva is in the mouth, it doesn't become it's not considered a liquid, and therefore even though it's wet, it's not one of the liquids that would make something susceptible to tumah at that point, unless he spit it. But while it's in his mouth, Rabbi Yossi says it would not. It's just considered part of the body, and therefore it would not make the produce susceptible to tumah. And Rabbi Yehuda makes a distinction. Hipech ba tameh, lo hipech ba tar. Rabbi Yehuda says, well, there's a distinction. If he turned it over, meaning he's ready to spit, so that's already separated from the body. It doesn't count as a part of the body. And there he agrees to Rabbi Meir that it would be considered a liquid that can make the produce susceptible to tumah. Whereas if he did not get ready to spit, so it's just saliva in the mouth, that does not count as separate from the body, and it would not be, and it would not make the produce susceptible to tumah. So if we transfer that to our conversation, why does in our Mishnah Rabbi Yehuda say that walking with saliva in your mouth, or with spit in the mouth, is going to be considered carrying? In regards to tuma, he doesn't say that it's carrying unless it's separate from the body, unless you're ready to spit. Why in our Mishnah does he not make that distinction? Rabbi Yechon says, yeah, there's a mix-up in who said what in the Mishnah, and we have to make Rabbi Yehuda align with the Rabbi Yehuda there. So either in our Mishnah it would not be Rabbi Yehuda, it would be Rabbi Meir, or over there it would be Rabbi Yehuda, not Rabbi. We would switch Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir. And Tosfos here says we're going to switch our Mishnah and say that Rabbi Meir in our Mishnah is that it's really Rabbi Meir who says that you would not be allowed to walk while you have spit in your mouth. Reish Lakish says no, we don't need to switch the opinions, and that they can match up. And in our Mishnah, where it says that you cannot walk, that's talking about if you brought phlegm up. It's not just having spit. It's where, because of a cough, he brought some phlegm into his mouth, and that's a substance that's not part of the mouth regularly. That's where he could not carry it. He would have to remove it before he continues walking in the public domain. But Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda Eimer, we have a brisa that says that Rabbi Yehuda says that if he has phlegm and it's separated, meaning he brought it up into his mouth, that he would not be allowed to carry. My lav roik v'nitlash. wouldn't you say that would be the same also if he separated spit in his mouth already? That would also be prohibition to carry. No, it's only if he has phlegm in his mouth. That's what Rish Lakish says. Tanya, wait, but that can't be true because we have a brisa that says no, we have a brisa that explicitly says, or Yehuda says, regardless of whether you have phlegm in your mouth that's separated or spit in your mouth that's separated, saliva, that you cannot carry until you spit it out. You cannot walk 4 amos until you spit it out. So rather, we have to follow Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation. Says that indeed these are contradictory statements of Rabbi Yehuda. We have to switch one to be Rabbi Meir and not Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish further said that kiach b'fnei rabbi, if somebody brings a phlegm and spits it out in front of his teacher, chayiv misa. He is that's worthy of death from Shemayim, from heaven. Shenema, for it says, "Kol mesanai ahavu maves." Those that hate me, and this is the Torah speaking. Right? The verse in Mishlei is speaking on behalf of the Torah, saying, "Kol mesanai ahavu maves." Those that hate me love death. And what does it mean? I'll take it mesanai. Those that hate me, elamasniai. Those that act inappropriately and bring shame to Torah, but bring degradation to Torah, and make others not want to honor and respect Torah. So and this would be someone who spits. And where it says, it's true, he's studying Torah with a teacher and he spit, but what is he supposed to do? He brought phlegm up into his mouth. So the Gemara says it's not bringing it into the mouth. It's kiach v'rak kamrinan. He's brought it up and he spit it out in front of the teachers teaching Torah. It shows it's a great disrespect. He should have put it into a tissue or turned around. He should not have spit it like that. And that shows a lack of respect and brings others to a lack of respect. The next Mishnah continues this idea of being in one domain, in one rishus, and doing action in another rishus. You should not be standing in a private domain and lean out into a public domain and drink, or in the public domain, and lean into a private place, a private domain, and drink. Unless he actually leans in so much that his head and most of the torso is in the domain that he's drinking from. Because then we know that he's not going to bring the drink back. But if he's just leaning in, he may actually bring the drink back into his domain. And once he crosses the boundary, he's transgressed the Torah prohibition. And so too in a wine press. And the Gemara is going to tell us what are we talking about, the wine press. So Reish Rabbanan, a Sefer Rabbi Meir. The first Mishnah, the Mishnah that we started today with, there it seems the Rabbanan, they're not concerned that you're going to end up carrying the item back to the position that you're in. And then in this Mishnah, we say you cannot drink from the other domain to this domain because we're concerned you're going to bring it back in. And that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. So which one is it? Rav Yosef so Rav Yosef says, well, actually, we can make a distinction. And here, even the Chachamim are going to agree that you're not allowed to carry it in the public domain because you need this item. Since you're trying to drink from it, you may end up bringing it to yourself. The previous mission was talking about you moving an item in the public domain while you're standing, but you don't intend to bring it to you. You're moving it within the public domain. So you don't need it. You're just trying to move it away. Therefore, you're allowed to move it as long as it's less than 4 hours because you don't intend to bring it to yourself. But over here, you're drinking. That's an item that you need, and you may end up bringing it to yourself. For Divrei HaKol, and even the Rabbanan would agree that you're not allowed to do this. So we're talking about a public domain and private domain. What about if it's in a Carmelis? It's the halachic in between space. It's not public. It's not private. Is there and there too rabbinically you're not allowed to carry from the public from this Carmelist, this rabbinic public domain, to the private domain. But if you did do so, it would not be a Torah prohibition. Is there also a prohibition from the Chachamim not to drink from such a space? Abaye says, yeah, same thing. Since you're not allowed to carry from that domain into your private domain, so too you're not allowed to drink leaning in, because you may end up doing so. Amar Rava says, no, that can't be. He gufa gzera. The only reason you're not allowed to carry from this rabbinic public domain is because it looks like and acts like a public domain, but really it's halachically not on a Torah level, not a public domain. And it's a rabbinic enactment that says, well, don't carry from there because in people's minds it looks like a public domain, and if you do so, they're going to end up carrying in a real public domain. So therefore, don't do it. So it itself is a gzera. V'anan nekam v'nigzar gzera l'gzera. He wants us to make a fence to the fence and say, and not only that, don't drink leaning into there because maybe you're going to end up bringing it back to your private domain. Well, you're not intending to do that. You're leaning in and drinking in the public domain, in this Carmelist, this rabbinic public domain. And even if by mistake you brought it back, you would not transgress the prohibition. You would only transgress the fence. So we're not going to make a fence to a fence. We're not going to make a gzera l'gzera. Abaye says, no, I can prove it to you. Because look at the end of the Mishnah. It says also in a wine press. Now, what's it talking about, the wine press? The wine press is not in the public domain. The wine press is going to be a private domain, and is going to lean in and drink from the public domain to the private domain and drink there. That would be exactly the same as the beginning. So why would you say so too by a wine press? If he's in the public domain and the wine press is in the private domain, of course, it's the same halacha that we said before, that you can't drink from one domain to the other. Must be that's talking about, like we would imagine, that the wine press, the wine is in the pit, which is a private domain, and he's standing around in an unenclosed space, which would be a Carmelist, a rabbinic public domain. And yet it says you can't drink unless you're completely leaning in. Rava says, no, the v'chein begas in our Mishnah, so too in the wine press, is not talking about carrying. You're right. That's exactly, it would only be prohibited in a private and public domain on a Torah level, which is the exact same case of the first part of the Mishnah. But rather, it's v'chein begas is referring to a halacha in regards to whether you have to tithe in meiser, in your meiser, tithing. And as we know, as a halacha, in order for produce to be ready to be tithed, it has to come to a certain level of completion in its processing. And the halacha is, until that point, you're allowed to nibble or have a non-kavua, non-set way of drinking or eating from it. So you can nibble on produce as you're harvesting. And so to over here, you can drink a little from the wine press as long as you didn't do it in a manner that completes it. Rav Sheshus also explained this way. The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, shosin alagas, you're allowed to drink from the wine press without tithing because it isn't a completed process yet. Bein bechamin, bein betzayin. And even if you're going to dilute it, which was the way that you would drink their wines, which were very thick, they would add water to it. And even if you added water to it, whether hot water or cold water, upater, and you don't have to tithe it. Divri Rabbi Meir. That's what Rabbi Meir says. However, Rabbi Eliezer ber Tzadik mechayev. Rabbi Eliezer ber Tzadik says that if you added water to it, now you've defined this wine as proper drinking of the wine, and therefore you have to tithe it before you drink any. And the Chachamim say, well, it depends. Alachamin, if you added warm water, chayev, then you're going to that really is defined as turning it into a proper product, because you're not going to throw it back in, and so therefore it counts as fully having harvested and completed the wine, because you now have it separate in the glass and you have to tithe it before you drink. But cold water that you added, which you can toss the rest back into the wine press once you tasted it, putter, you're going to be exempt because you toss the rest back in. So that's what it means in our Mishnah. So too by the wine press, that if you're leaning in a little bit, you may actually bring it out, and then it's going to count as having separated it, and you're going to have to tithe. If you're leaning over it, then it's not going to count as separating it, and you don't have to tithe.
So I have a question. Yeah. If with tavua, putting it in a pile is sufficient to say, all right, that's kind of the limitation where you can eat it without having to tithe, why is taking the grapes off the vine and piling them up not the same thing?
So grapes that would be eaten, that's the end product. But grapes that are being made into wine, it's still in the midst of a product. And so it always depends on the intent. So if these grapes are the type that nobody makes into wine, they're table grapes, or you're harvesting them for the table. So indeed, you're right. As soon as you harvest them, they would count, and you made them into a pile, that would count as the end product. And they're a chayiv and ma'aser, obligated in tithing. However, over here, this is a winemaker. And so when he harvests it, it's still in the midst of the process. So that doesn't count as completing the process until such time that he's pressed it and separated the skins, etc., until it becomes drinkable, until he's made the end product. And everything would be the same. Each item, depending on what it is, would have some sort of point that's the end product for it.
I have one question for you too. So in this Mishnah, the concern is that you're going to bring something back from one domain. Is that the liquid in your mouth that you're drinking?
Well, no, you may bring the cup or whatever you're drinking with, right? You may lean back to drink, and even though you were first leaning over the domain line, but as you lean back, you may actually bring the cup with you, right?
Okay.
So
would the liquid be a concern, like with the
no?
plant?
Once it's in your mouth, it's in your mouth. No, there isn't the concern that it's running through your body. No.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So for this next Mishnah, it's the same idea. You're bringing something from a public domain to a private domain or vice versa. So this fellow is standing in a public domain, and the roofs back when were flat. And in order to get the water off of the flat roofs, they'd have spouts or drains, and they'd have a gutter running along the roof. That gutter, because it runs along the roof, essentially is a part of the roof. Even as much as 3 tefachim from the top of the roof would just be considered a halachic extension of the roof, as we know that lavud makes it 1. So even though that the gutter itself may be 1 tefach wide, 3-4 inches wide, but nevertheless, since it's abutted against the building to get the water running off from the roof, it really is just an extension of the roof. And as such, when somebody takes water directly from there, they are taking it from a private domain and they're standing in a public domain. So you're not allowed to do that. So you cannot get water from the private domain if the pipe is within public domain, unless he is doing so that where he's catching it as it drops off, but he's not putting his cup or his bucket that he's getting the water into up directly next to the opening of the gutter, because if he does, then he's essentially taking it off the roof, which is a private domain. However, if the gutter itself would sometimes have a downspout, which would then come, which would be away from the building, usually more than 4 tefachim, and therefore he can drink the water even if he puts his cup or his bucket directly near the spout itself. So Kollel in Aval Mitzaref Lo. He can. So the Mishnah says what this means is he's allowed to get the water as it's running off, but he's not allowed to put his vessel, whether bucket or whatever, or cup, directly against the gutter, because by doing so he's taking it directly off of the roof, or he's having it come directly from the roof into his possession. My time, because the gutter, the assumption is that the gutter is within 3 tefachim of the top of the roof, and therefore it's just an extension of the roof itself. The chalpachas megimel samach legag kagagnami, because within 3 tefachim is lavud, and so it counts as if it is in the roof itself. It's coming from the roof itself, and therefore he cannot get the water from there, because by doing so, it's as if he's taking it off of the private domain into directly in, and he's in the public domain. Tanya Name Hachi, indeed, we have a brisa that teaches like this.
Is it correct that the downspout is in the Rishus Harabim?
All of this is in the public domain. Our Mishnah said everything is within 10 tefachim of the public domain. Meaning, essentially, the building is on a hillside, right? So the public domain is within 10 tefachim of the top of the building. So the building itself on the is, you're only seeing the roof and the top 30, 40 inches of the building. That's what's going on.
But the top of the downspout is lavud to the roof, and the roof is Rishus Yachid, right?
The roof is a private domain. It's a Rishus Yachid because of it's a house, right? And the gutter, being that it's within 3 tefachim, is lavud. It's connected and considered an extension of the roof itself. So even though the gutter, if you would look at it on its own, it would not be defined as a private domain because it's too narrow. But as an extension of the roof, it just becomes a part of the roof itself and is a part of the private domain. And so when you take if you are gathering the water in a cup or a bucket in the public domain, because it's within 10 tefachim of the ground, and you have it directly against the end of the gutter, so you're taking from a private domain to a public domain. But if you have it lower down, so it's running into your bucket, that's fine, because it's coming already in the airspace of the public domain before it gets into your bucket.
Wait, so what?
So you haven't taken from the private domain, and we're not concerned that you're going to get into the private domain and take it, because it's all in the public domain.
Oh, so the byproduct is in the public domain. How it got there does.
Oh, it came from the private domain, but that's not an issue. We're not concerned. Right. We're only concerned where you're taking it directly from the private domain, because you may end up going into the private domain to get it.
So if I took a cup and dipped it in the bucket and drank it in the Rishus Harabim, that's fine.
Sure. That's the first part of the Mishnah. You can gather the water from a gutter as long as it's below 10 tefachim, and you're not putting the bucket or your cup directly against the private domain. Tanya Name, indeed, we have a brisa like this. Person can stand in a private domain, lift his hands up above the 10 tefachim, as to less than 3 tefachim close to the roof, and receive water, gather the water that comes in, as long as he doesn't put his vessel up against the opening of the gutter. Tanya, Yidach, we have another brisa. Brisa says at the inverse, person may not stand in the public domain and lift his hands up and gather the water if his vessel is directly against the gutter. But he can let it flow in, gather that, and drink. However, from the spout, the pipe, he may. What is as we explained, because that is away from the building. Tanya im yesh betzina dalad aser. However, if it is a large plank that is bringing the water away from the building, it's 4x4, it's going to be prohibited because that itself would count as a private domain, and he's bringing the water from a private domain to a public domain. The next halacha in the Mishnah is dealing with from a private domain to another private domain that's within the public domain. We've seen somebody has a pit at the side of the public domain that is a private domain within a public domain. Or if there's a garbage pile on the side of the public domain, that would also count as a private domain within the public domain. So, bar b'rshus harabim, whether there's a pit in the public domain, v'chol yasser, gavoya yud tfachim, if combined, whether the pit itself or combined with the dirt that had been removed from the pit, which is on the sides of it, it counts as 10 tfachim high. So now that's going to be a private domain. That's going to be a total of 10 tfachim. Chalon she'al gabav, if you have a window directly above it, you can fill water from that pit by drawing the water in from the pit into your house on Shabbos. Because it's private domain to private domain, as long as there's no space of Rishus Harabim between the pit and your window. Similarly, Ashpa Rishus Harabim, if there's a garbage pile in the public domain, Gavaya Yud Tfachim, as long as it's 10 tefachim high, 4x4 wide, so it's defined as its own private domain. So, Chalon Shal Gabav, if you have a window directly above it, you can pour your garbage into that space on Shabbos. So Gemara says, what are we talking about? Is it directly close to your window? So why do I need that the pile of dirt on the side of the pit is 10 tefachim? He says, no, the pit itself is 4 tefachim away from the window. However, because you have the pile next to it, so that also defined as a private domain, and so you never have public domain between the window and the water, and so you can draw it. And because of the pile of dirt on the side, it's going to count. But if not, you'd end up carrying the water from the pit, which is a private domain, into your window, which is a private domain, across a public domain space, and that would be prohibited. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, there could even be that a Mishnah is talking about that the pit is directly next to your window. And the Mishnah is only teaching us something we've already seen earlier, that even if the pit is only 7 tefachim wide, deep, but the mound of water, the mound of dirt around the pit is another 3 tefachim, that would count as 10 and as a private domain, even though that the pit itself is not deep enough. Ashba b'rshus harabim. And the last halacha we saw was if there was a garbage pile in a public domain that also counts as a private domain. And we're not concerned that maybe you're going to somebody will remove that garbage, and in the end, what's going to end up happening if somebody removes it, you're going to pour something out there, throw something out there, and it won't be a private domain anymore because the 10 tefachim high pile is gone. So Gemara says, how can you say we're not concerned about that? Well, Ravim bar Ada bar Amar Rav Yitzchak, he told a story in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak. There was a story with an alleyway that the alleyway has to have walls, but this alleyway didn't have walls. The alleyway on one side had the river or the water. Kollel was open to the sea. And the other side just had a heaping pile of garbage, which was tall enough to count as a wall, and we're concerned that maybe it's going to be taken away. And the question was asked of Rabbi Yehuda Anasi of Rebbe whether or not you're allowed to carry within that alleyway. Does it count like it's enclosed? And he wouldn't say permissible or prohibited. He wouldn't say it's permissible. He was afraid that maybe the garbage will be taken away and end up not having a wall there. or v'yala a yam sirtin, or the water level will drop, and you're going to have you're not going to have water on the side of the road, but rather just banks, water, sea, sand. But he wouldn't say it was prohibited either, because after all, right now there were walls. So you see that we are concerned that maybe the garbage is going to be taken away. So Gemara says, if it's a private garbage, we're concerned that it's going to be taken away, because ultimately it needs to be taken away. But if it's a public dump, so that is made to remain there, and therefore there's no concern that it will be removed.